You're here today with Janelle Barker for Your Story, His Glory. And today we're going to interview Dr. John Temple. We're so excited to have him. John Temple grew up in South Africa, where he studied mathematics, physics, and various branches of engineering, leading to a BS in engineering from the University of Witwatersrand in 1962. He then obtained a PhD in physics and electronics from King's College London, followed by an MBA equivalent from the University of South Africa. From an engineering and scientific background, he moved into management processing to various director, chief executive of 3 different companies over a 30-year period. His last full-time job of 13 years was as chief executive of Plessey Corporation. Did I say that right?
Plessey Corporation.
Plessey Corporation, a listed company with offices or subsidiaries in 8 countries, including South Africa, the UK, Australia, and Southeast Asia. After retiring from full-time work, he and his son founded a computer company, Saratoga, with offices in South Africa, the UK, the USA. As he was also an academic, he has taught 5 different subjects at 2 universities in England and 3 in South Africa. He was a scientific advisor and the advisor on cellular rollout to the SA government. From a teenager, he has been a keen student and teacher of practical theology, endeavoring to reconcile a Christian worldview with daily life. He has been involved in church leadership from youth work to eldership. He was chairman of the Bible Institute of South Africa and served on the councils of Cape Town University and the Peninsula Technikon. And in the UK, he served on the board of West, W-E-S-T, now Union College, and was a founder board member of Christian Prison Resourcing. In the UK, he also served on an advisory council of the president of the FIEC. He has written 5 books dealing with the application of biblical principles to practical living at work, in the home, and in the church. John has 16 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, all of whom are his great joy. For many years, he lived part of the years in Sydney, Australia, and Switzerland, and permanently for much of this century in the New Forest, England, but now resides in Johnson City, Tennessee. That is a long bio. However, we just celebrated a birthday for you, and John Temple just turned 84.
Right.
So you've had a long life to accomplish all of these things. However, I don't know that most people could even accomplish all these things in 84 years. So we're so excited to have you today to talk about your life experiences and just to know about how God has created this scenario for you and become sovereign in your life. And we're just thrilled to have you as part of this show. John is a friend of ours, and he also comes to Heritage Baptist Church. And so he was willing to actually come and talk with us today, and so that we can kind of get a better understanding of who our neighbors are in our congregation. Who is this Christian family that we actually get a chance to interact with each Sunday and throughout the week. So welcome, John.
You're very welcome. I'm pleased to be here. I just hope you'll appreciate my English, which of course comes without any accent.
It's the Southern accent.
That's the troubling one. But I've learned to translate.
Okay. I'm so glad. Yes, it has been sometimes a challenge for us to match up our Southern accents so that we can communicate well, but I hope we can do that today. So, John, would you tell us about how old you were when you became a Christian and how that came about?
Well, I was about 4 years old, actually. I remember it. I remember getting a strong faith and believing there was a God and believing that He answered prayer. So I really grew up like that. My mother was a keen Christian, and she was a major influence on my life. And so I really had the privilege of growing up in a Christian family. All my brothers and sisters were Christians as well.
Did your mother take you to church regularly?
No, she didn't, because when she was saved and told my father, he said, "That's fine, I respect your views, but do not influence the children." And she did not directly influence any of us, but every one of us was saved, and he was too. But no, so she let us continue going to what seemed to just be the traditional church for us to go to, which was the Church of England in South Africa. It so happened that the one that we attended was an extremely good one, and a very good pastor at that. So I spent until about 14 in that church. Then I believed in baptism, so I moved to a Baptist church where I was baptized, and the rest of my youth anyway was spent in that church, leading a youth group, and that's also where I met my wife.
So, as a young boy, were you, because of your father not wanting to encourage you all in your faith, did that cause you to dig more into the Bible? Did that?
I don't think so. I think he was extremely tolerant. He didn't mind at all, just so long as we made up our own minds about what we believed. But interestingly, a sort of a long-distant aunt of ours, and I've no idea how she was related to us, for some reason, on my 16th birthday, gave me a book for a birthday present. She never gave me one before nor after, but she gave me Berkhoff's Systematic Theology, and I loved that. And so at 16, I sat down and started writing notes to teach the youth. And believe it or not, I still have those notes. They're all beautifully typed up 50 years ago, and I'm still teaching that course.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yes.
That's incredible. For my Christian walk, I never had anyone emphasizing theology, and never had anyone say, you need to figure this out, or you need to have your own idea and understanding of the gospel. And that's a wonderful way to parent. Yeah, maybe your father did a great job in, helping you to really get that foundation of what you believed, and then you were able to live that out.
Yeah, I mean, that became my passion from a youth, and that is to live with a Christian worldview. And that really has been what I've spent my whole life doing, trying to discover God's will and God's way, be it in the home or be it at work or be it in the church. Do it God's way.
So you grew up during apartheid in South Africa. Would you tell our listeners what that is, and how that affected, did that make you more determined to live out your faith? How did that affect your Christian life?
Yes, obviously that was very important, because throughout my youth, and even after we returned from England, for many years we were still living in apartheid. Now, first of all, the word apartheid simply means separateness. So it was just an Afrikaans word for racial discrimination, if you liked. It may even have been an honest attempt by an academic, a man by the name of Dr. Verwoerd, who was an academic, to say, look, the races don't easily mix, so let's rather create a method of separate development, and that's what he called it. Of course, it could never work. It was a crazy idea in a country in which 85% of the population were Africans, and that's where they live. That's their country. And we had, at that stage, about 15% of the population were immigrants from Europe, largely Britain, Holland, and Portugal. And this 15% were ruling the country, and by law segregated the races, at least tried to. In practice, of course, you couldn't. I mean, 8.5 people that you bump into in the street are actually going to be Africans, and in the shops and everywhere else, because really they were living in the same place that we were. So it was a crazy idea and could never have worked. And fortunately, of course, they eventually saw the light and reversed it, which is an amazing thing in itself. But how did it affect us? Well, legally, Africans were not permitted to do certain jobs. They were not allowed to stay overnight in a white area. Wow. So if I, for example, had an African pastor visiting me, it was illegal for me to have him stay with me. Now, all of this, I and most of the people in the church that we founded, just ignored. And there's an important lesson in all of this. What we decided is we had to be civilly disobedient. And I think we've got to take that to heart, because we're entering into an age at the moment in which I think Christians are going to be forced to break the law for the sake of the gospel. And that's exactly what we did. What doesn't come out in the bio is that during the 1970s, which is when we actually established or planted a new church, I also ran a property development company. And I used to personally play architect and design the houses that I built, and then we'd build those houses. And in time, my entire team of builders were Africans. Now, Africans were not permitted to do any of the skilled trades. So you could, for example, have them mixing the mortar, bringing the mortar to you, even putting it on top of the bricks. Bearing in mind, South Africa, houses are bricks and mortar, but they were not permitted to put one brick upon another. That had to be done by a white man. And you could have them preparing the walls to paint, and in fact put an undercoat on, but you couldn't put the top coat on. Well, I don't know that this law could have ever been enforced, because certainly I just broke it all the time. I had all blacks doing everything virtually, and I also learned to pay them exactly the same as I would have paid a white man for doing that job. So that's the sort of thing we had to do. Another interesting one was when we built it at our new church, we were forced to put in white and black bathrooms. And unfortunately, we couldn't get around that law, and it so happened one of the deacons of our church was actually the director of town planning and architecture for the city. We asked him if he could do anything, and he said he couldn't. That was national law. It's like federal law in this country. We simply had to do that. So we did. We built it with black and white toilets, and then the moment the building was over and the inspectors had been, we took down the signs and we turned the black toilets into storerooms and put our lawnmowers in there. All that sort of thing was complete nonsense. We put a sign on, and I personally put the sign on our board outside, which was there until fairly recently when they changed it, saying all races welcome. And so our church was completely multiracial. And when I visited it a few years ago, it was multiracial from the eldership down. So that it actually stuck. These are the sort of challenges that we are faced with. Having said that, I worked, as you already picked up, closely with the government in various largely scientific roles. The government were aware of my liberal views in those days. It was regarded as liberal. They were aware of it. And so when they decided they wanted to change, because they did realize we're going the wrong way, we've got to do 180. I was actually approached and asked if I would help the government do that, because they knew I was credible with the African community and many African leaders. They even asked me to go up to Zambia to negotiate with Thabo Mbeki, who later became the Prime Minister of South Africa. I refused. I said, I'm not a politician. The politicians must do politicians' work. So I was involved in the transition, but I managed to persuade a group that I was a member of, or at least I was a member of the executive. It was called Christian Business, or Concerned Christian Businesses, or something like that. Actually started by a liberal theologian, but he invited me onto the board, and I persuaded the board and our organization that as business people, our job was not to come up with a political solution. The politicians had to do that. We could do what business people were good at, and that's organize the show. So we did. And a thing called CODESA, and I'm afraid, don't ask me to give you what that stood for, but it had something to do with writing a new constitution. We organized it. I jokingly said to the folk, we'll make the coffee, and we'll make copies of everything. And we organized it. And in that organization, they thrashed out a new constitution. I also must say this, that the evangelical church generally went along with apartheid, on the grounds of Romans 13, must obey the government. But not everyone. There were some outstanding people who really took the government to task, including Professor of Theology at the University of South Africa, who was the brother of the president. And he persuaded the president that it was morally wrong. And other Christians did stand up. And so I think the Christians had a major influence on what actually happened. And we had this remarkable thing happen. It hasn't happened in any of the other trouble spots of the world, where the government of the day, which was white, supported by a white electorate, went to a referendum in which 80% of the whites voted to about face. And the nation turned around. And F.W. de Klerk, who was the president at the time, stood down so that Nelson Mandela could become the president, and he became the deputy president. And today, the then ruling political party, which was the Nationalist Party, have merged with the ANC, the African Party. That was the extent of it. I might tell you, F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela both won the Nobel Prize for that. And so they deserved it. It was an amazing thing to do. And if you go to South Africa today, people live in harmony with each other.
It's incredible. And that Christian influence and the way that you treated people with respect, regardless.
Well, yes, I've got some amusing stories there. I would have absolutely nothing to do with apartheid. I wouldn't join any organization, wouldn't support anything that was remotely following apartheid. And when I became chief executive the first time of a fairly large company, actually, on day one, I announced that there would be no racism in the company. All signs of it would be abolished. I'm pleased to say a lot of it actually had been. There was no restriction on who did what, despite the fact that it was illegal sometimes. But I have an amusing anecdote. I also announced that on day one, we would abolish black bathrooms and white bathrooms. We would abolish a black canteen and a white canteen, and we'd have one. Well, there was a lot of pushback on that, so I decided to go and have lunch myself in the canteen, although I had a little private dining room actually associated with my office suite. I went down and I got in the line to get my lunch in the canteen. And there was a guy standing in front of me, and he was carrying his own plate and knife and fork. So I said to him, do I have to bring my own knife and fork? You see, he didn't know who I was, by the way. And so he thought I was just some new worker, which I was, second day. He said, no, they've got plates and knives and forks and everything there. I said, well, why have you got one? He said, because we've got this new crazy chief executive, and he said that there can only be one canteen. And he said, I'm not eating off a plate that maybe yesterday an African ate off of. So I said to him, now tell me, who is in the kitchen making the food, who's washing the dishes and all the rest of it? And to this day, I can remember the look on his face as he suddenly realized. Anyway, those sort of stories occurred all over the place. And I did it 3 times. So I got quite good at abolishing any vestiges of apartheid. So that's how my theology, the theology of saying neither Greek nor Jew, applied.
And you had to live that out every day. So it was just second nature to you, right?
Yes, it was. It was, and yet I'm not saying that I was perfect. And my own sort of development in non-racism and how to treat the races and so on has gone on developing throughout my life. It's a more complicated subject than the simple one that we were faced with in South Africa. So I'm grateful to the Lord for continuing to show me what I should do and how I should live.
Amen. So there's a story that you told me that is really great, that goes along with your stance on racism. And I would love for you to share it. When you lived in the top of the bakery and the gentleman came in late at night to get some food with his boombox on his shoulder.
Oh, yes.
So this was what, the 80s when
yes, this would have been in the 70s, yes, when apartheid was probably at its peak. Yes, we lived we lived at the top of a hill, and down below there was a very South African type of shop. We called it a cafe. I guess it was a sort of almost a drugstore, or pretty well open 24/7. And at night, Africans who, bear in mind, were not permitted to have homes in white areas, but they were permitted to be servants, domestic servants, and stay on the premises, and most homes had some sort of accommodation for a servant. But at night they wanted to have fellowship, they wanted to meet one another. So they would go down to the cafe and they would buy themselves something to eat or drink and just generally socialize. And I went down one night because I wanted to buy some bread, because one of the things they would also have would be fresh bread. I went down to buy a loaf of bread, and there was a fair number of Africans hanging around, as always. And one of them had a great big boombox on his shoulder, which was popular in those days, which was playing very loud. And the owner of this particular cafe, and by the way, these cafes were all run by Greek immigrants for some odd reason, he came out and he was mad, and he grabbed this boombox and he threw it on the ground and smashed it. I was mad about this, so I went into him and said to him, that's just not on. Now, you find out what that cost and you reimburse that man the cost. He said, you don't know what I have to put up with. I said, I don't care what you have to put up with. That's just not right. I looked around, and by now there were several hundred Africans out there. I don't know where they all came from, but they all came. And all of a sudden I realized I'm very pleased I'm on this side of the argument. And I think this cafe owner looked as well, and he opened his register and he took the money out and gave it to him.
I love this. I love that.
By the way, the next morning, our own domestic maid had heard the story.
Less than 24 hours, you're a legend.
Hours later.
That's great. So as you grew up in this community, what challenges did you see that actually grew your faith and helped you to live that out? Like, so that's the thing that you've written 5 books about. How do you practically live out your Christian life? Those are our challenges every day. And I want to unwrap that mystery. Tell us how you've done that. What has motivated you?
Well, we're always motivated by love of Christ. Paul said that. I realized early on in my career that I was going to live differently, and I was going to do my work differently. It's not just about being honest and things like that. Of course, it is those things, but it's much deeper than that. Our very presuppositions about people, for example, matter. At the business schools, and bear in mind, I not only went to one of the things I did for 2 years on separate occasions was I held the professorship, full-time professorship, at that same business school, which at the time, incidentally, I think was the largest business school in the world, modeled on Harvard and teaching the Harvard doctrine, if you like. The teaching in the business schools was then, and I think still is, entirely based on humanism. The textbooks were written by the likes of B.F. Skinner and others who were atheist humanists. And their presuppositions about human beings, basically, for example, being good, the scripture tells us that we're not. And therefore, all the conclusions they reach, what you build up from that, are wrong about the human beings that you're working with or that you're managing. So my first book was actually about work and how you behave in the workplace. But I also came to realize that even as a chief executive of a company, trying to make a difference, and I've already told you what we did with regard to racism, and I did the same sort of thing with regard to just our treatment of one another, of people, of treating people as people. For example, I insisted that right early on in any of the companies that I moved into, and I had this experience 3 times of moving in as the chief executive from outside, not knowing a soul, not knowing anything much about the company even. I wanted to meet every single person in the company. Now, that got quite difficult because these companies were thousands of employees. But when I met them, I wanted to know them, their full, real names. And that had to come with a title. So it was Mr. or Mrs. or Doctor or whatever it may be. And then for the Africans, I wanted their African name, not their English name. I mean, even Nelson Mandela is not Nelson at all. That was a name given to him because his school teacher couldn't pronounce his real name.
Is that right?
And so every African would have an African name. And because the most common name in Africa is John, every second African you met just took the name John, which is okay for me. But so I insisted that every supervisor, every foreman, every manager had to learn the names of his employees with, as I said, the correct title and also the real African name. That was showing real respect to human beings. But I'll tell you another anecdote. As you already mentioned, the company that I led for the last 13 years of my life was this company, Plessy Corporation, which we listed on the stock exchange in South Africa. But that meant that our shares were also traded in Wall Street and London. And so I used to go over to London and to New York, to Wall Street, and do presentations of the company so that stockbrokers could decide to buy or not buy, asset managers, our shares. And on one occasion, I was in Wall Street doing a presentation, and I'd come along, nicely prepared with the PowerPoint presentation and all the rest of it. And I was like halfway through giving this presentation when one of the stockbrokers got up and he said, "What's in it for you?" What do you mean? What are you going to make out of all this?
Well.
And I was completely bold. Well, yes, do you have shares? No, I don't, or stock. But I do have stock options. How many? Honestly, I don't know. That's not important. Not important. That's everything. What do you mean not important? I do the best I can for the job, whether I have stock options or not. Half the audience walked out.
Wow. Wow.
You're in a different world.
They didn't respect the things you respected.
No. Never mind that I was running a company where all the ratios were incredible. We'd grown at 33% compound from the time I moved in, over 13 years.
Wow.
We moved from whatever it would have been to effectively in today's dollars to $1 billion company. And we were a really small company to start with. Notwithstanding all of that, that the people who had bought us out from the British, we were a British company, but the company in South Africa that bought us out when that company folded, or didn't fold, it was taken over, the value of the shares they purchased, or stock I should say in this country, to when we finally delisted the company, their shares had grown 20-fold in about 5 years.
The Lord blessed you.
And yet the stockbrokers weren't interested.
So you have told us how you specifically can live out your faith in work, in a workplace. I think that is so critical because we want to be living our lives as Christians. We want to live for the Lord, but sometimes we don't know those simple, just direct ways. And for you to actually put that in a book, I think is fabulous, because I hear us often in our congregation, in our dialogue with other people in ministry say, what does that look like? What does living that out look like? And how does that affect my conversations, the attitude that I have towards people? And so those are some specifics in the workplace, but you wrote 4 other books. Will you tell us which other concepts you wrote about, and how some of those pieces have been applied in your life?
Well, I think another very important point was the scripture tells us to love everyone, including our enemies. And I concluded that also meant love your customers. And so what I taught, for example, the salespeople is agape love of your customer. Now, how do you actually do that? And what I taught were several things. First of all, you never think evil of them. Now, I was often frustrated by customers. Customers can be very difficult. But I forced myself not to think evil of them, only to think good. Because the moment you start thinking evil, sooner or later that's going to come out. So you want to show them respect at all times and to love them. It also means that you always do the best for them, not for you. So I told all my salespeople, you're entitled to put your customers' interest ahead of the company's. And I will accept that. There's another thing. In Scripture, you sometimes read the expression face to face. You may remember Moses was described as talking to God as a man talks to his friend face to face. And Paul says to us, we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. We look forward to the day when we can, in fact, meet with God and our Savior face to face. And I think that's an important element of our interpersonal relationships, that we meet face to face. And so one of the things that I did on that day, there was about 20 things that I introduced, but one of them was, if you need to sort something out with a colleague, you go and do it face to face. I banned the use of political emails, actually there weren't emails in those days, political memos, of which there were thousands floating around the company.
And there were fax machines.
There were fax machines and there were word processors. Fortunately, and certainly the last company I went to, there was a rule that one copy of every memo had to go into a file which was circulated amongst the directors. So in fact, it landed on my desk. And and every day it was this thick. and that was just not going to continue. In fact, I said, anybody continuing to do that, that is reason to be fired. I want you to go and sort things out face to face. The only things that need to be written down are things like specifications and, technical facts. That needs to be written down, of course, but not political memos in which you're defending yourself. Go and sit and talk to people. And that means you've got to go, in the early days it was across South Africa, you've got to fly from, the company is based in Cape Town, most of our business was Johannesburg, a lot of our staff were up in Johannesburg. If that means you've got to go up to Johannesburg, you go up. And so there were hundreds of people going up and down all the time, just about filling a plane.
And you were willing to emphasize that, even if it cost you lots of money.
I said I would not question people's travel.
Yeah.
They could break budget travel. If there's a good reason for it. If there isn't a good reason, of course, then you're in trouble, but for other reasons. You go and talk to people face to face. And on one occasion, right early on, one of my directors came in to complain about another one. And I simply said to him, just hang on a second. Went to my secretary and said, call the other guy in. And they were sitting around my table. I said, right, and I say it all again. Deal face to face with people. And,
that's a good example in our families, in our interpersonal relationships, in our Christian families. I actually had this conversation yesterday with someone that I was trying to give some counsel to about her family. And, in not thinking ill of them or not thinking that they are going to respond in a negative way about the things that were difficult for her to present. And remember that your family loves you. And if we wrap the premise of what you're saying in the conversation in love and respect for that person, then it totally changes the tone of what you're saying and what they're hearing and how they respond. And the face-to-face also allows people to not respond harshly. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the key to all of this really is this question of love, agape love. Love which cares for the welfare of the recipient, not the giver. And that was quite a powerful thing to me, not only so internally in the company, but externally as well, with everybody, be it the banker or be it a customer or whatever it may be.
And as you're thinking of living a Christian life, who is the perfect example of agape love?
Absolutely.
God is love. And I think sometimes we miss those simple concepts of Christian living because we simply don't want to. We don't want to love our neighbor. For me personally, my relationship with the Lord changed drastically when He brought it to my attention that I was not loving people. He brought me to my knees, recognizing that I say I want to be like Him. I want to be like Jesus. And what did He do? He loved His church. He loves His bride. And I did not love others. And that changed my heart towards Him and others at the same time. So as you have loved people well, and seen the benefits of that, even in business and in finance and how you are fair to people, what are those other pieces that is easily translated into in our daily lives?
Well, if I can just change the subject slightly, one of the features of my life, and I always used to say my stockholders had no business benefiting as they did, and I've already told you how the stock price rose, was God's providence in my life. There were just too many, let's call them coincidences for a moment, that lined up to regard them as coincidences. They can only be providence. May I give an example?
Sure.
I could have given 1,000 examples, I'm not kidding. But let me just give you one, which is so remarkable that if You don't believe it, well, I can't blame you. But it is true, and I can assure you, I could get people to come along and they're still living who could vouch for it. In the early 90s, the whole world was busy discovering cellular telephony, and was one of the things that we had been watching very closely because we believed there was a great future there. So we were dead keen. We were basically an electronic communication company, so this is one area we were going to jump into. In South Africa, most of the supply of telecommunications equipment was held by two companies, the German Siemens and the French Alcatel, through their offices in South Africa. They had obtained long-term contracts, which had gone on for decades, with Telkom, which was a government department running the telephone systems, and automatically they just got the business. I'm not going to say any more than that, but it was highly suspicious. I happen to know, and I don't know how I know this now, I probably did then, Siemens wrote a paper for the government saying that they had investigated cellular and they'd come to the conclusion that there would be less than 100,000 subscribers in South Africa. By the way, the population of Africa is about 60 million. Less than 100,000, which was equal to what the analog system, which had gone in during the late 80s, by Siemens, was a Siemens system, and they had about 60,000 customers, of which I was one, by the way. But anyway, they said that when the new systems arrive, what we're all familiar with today, about 60,000 users. I happen to know this. So I wrote a paper for my board criticizing that and pointing out why it was wrong and what I thought should happen. And that was totally liberalized, not held by the government. I said at least 4 different suppliers should be given licenses. It should be in the hands of free enterprise, etc., etc. Now, this paper I gave to the board, but somehow it landed up on the president of South Africa's desk. Well, I think I know how it happened, but anyway, that in itself was a providence. One evening I came back from church and the phone was ringing, and I answered the phone, and it was the Minister of Telecommunications, like the head of the FAA in this country, on the phone, Piet Welgemuth. And he said to me, "John, I've just come back from an all-day cabinet meeting, and at the end of talking about cellular, at the end of it, the president said," this was in the days of F.W. de Klerk, the president eventually said, "Pitt, you go and ask John Temple. He knows what to do." I'm not kidding you. That was exactly what he said to me on the phone.
Wow.
So I said to him, "Well, that's fine. I'll come up." He was in Pretoria. "I'll come up to Pretoria when, make an appointment. I'll come and see you." So we agreed a date. Anyway, I used to go up to 3 times a week from Cape Town to Johannesburg. It's a distance of about 1,000 miles, by the way. So I used to do this 3 times a week. And I got it down to such a fine art. These were the days before the security, that I used to arrive at the airport 5 minutes before the plane had to take off. And I had a deal with Avis. I knew the Avis chairman very well, and I had a permanent car from them, and I had a phone in my car, so I would phone ahead and I would say to Avis, "I'm approaching the airport. Please have somebody standing at departures to collect my car because I'm going to jump out and run." And this would happen up to 3 times a week, and I'd run in. I'd phone up the South African Airways. In those days, I had a monopoly on these routes. I'd phone up South African Airways, the guy, the duty controller that I also knew, and say, "I'm coming, have my boarding pass ready." And I'd collect it and run on the plane. And it literally was a sort of a 5-minute thing. Well, on one occasion, I did that, and I jumped on the plane. And when I got to my seat, I always used to fly economy class, by the way. I got to my seat, there was a guy sitting there, his jacket off and all comfortable, and he was in my seat. So he immediately said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and he pulls out his boarding pass, was identical to mine. Now, I also knew the chief executive of South African Airways, and he said, "That is impossible. A computer cannot issue 2 boarding passes to 2 different names for the same seat on the same plane. Anyway, at that point, flight attendant came along, and it's always a problem. And they said to me, look, we as a matter of principle always keep seat 1A in first class to the last minute in case a cabinet minister wants to fly. We're busy closing the door. There's no way a cabinet minister is coming. Would you mind sitting in 1A? No, I don't mind sitting in 1A. Just, twist my arm enough. I'll travel first class any day. So I went up and sat in 1A. There was a guy sitting next to me, and he was huffing and puffing, and he had a huge file that he was reading and complaining and so on. And he passed on dinner. They used to serve an excellent dinner. I didn't. I had my dinner. And at the end of all of this, I left him alone because he was clearly working. At the end of it all, eventually I said to him, you seem to have a problem. And he said, yes, he said, it's this minister of mine. He's given me an impossible job. Well, what is what is it? Or you want to say anything more? And he said, yes. He said, the government wants to go ahead with cellular telephony in this country. And I'm the head of the privatization unit in the government. And the government at that stage were busy unwinding a lot of state-owned assets and were, in fact, going for more privatization, more public, at least more private companies. And he said, I frankly don't know how to do this at all. So I said, funny you should mention that. Piet Velgemuth, the minister, called me on Sunday to say he wanted some advice from me on this as well. And he looked at me, he said, are you John Temple? I said, yes. Right, he said. And he gave me the file. He said, that's yours.
He handed off his problem.
And then he called and said, dinner, please. His problem was gone. Well, we became very good friends. Eugene van Rensburg was his name. He was a Christian man. And that's how I got the job of not only advising the South African government, but actually writing the license agreement for cellular in South Africa, which I did till 2 in the morning. I know it was 2 in the morning because my wife used to force me to bed at 2. Now, that was a series of amazing coincidences. What else could it be but providence? But that's where it isn't where it ended. Because I should tell you, I was actually got an official letter of appointment from the government, and in those days I was paid $12 an hour for my work.
Was that a large salary then?
No, there was probably 10% or less than what I was earning. But anyway, I accepted that. I went to the board and said, look, I'm prepared to give it to the company, and they said, you can keep it. If you're doing it at 2 in the morning, you can keep the money. I didn't get rich on it. Okay. I told the government, when I responded to the letter of appointment, I said, look, I'll get to the point of writing the tender documents and the license agreement, and then I'm out of here, because I want to get into this business. And they agreed to that, and I then recommended somebody to take over from me. He was another Christian person I knew who had just retired from telecommunications, and he did a great job. So we got out of it. I then went to see a company that was supplying the satellite broadcasting in South Africa, a company called Mnet. They still are. And their technical boss was another Christian that I knew, a guy by the name of Jock Anderson. And I went to see him and I said to him, look, you guys should be in cellular. He said, yes, we've been thinking about it. So I want to make a deal with you. I'll give you a team of people to produce a response to the tender document which is coming out. I can assure you I know exactly what is intended. I wrote that document. And I've got a fine team of people that I can put together. You can have them free, gratis, and for nothing. And I think we gave them 15 or 20 people. On one condition, that we here and now sign a contract that says, if you get the license, we get to building the network. They drafted an agreement, which to my knowledge still stands. Wow. Which we signed up. I then went to the 2 great suppliers of cellular equipment in those days, which were Ericsson and Nokia. I went to Nokia first, actually, and said to them, look, first of all, I know exactly what's going on in this field, and of course by now everybody knew that I knew about it. And secondly, I've signed an agreement with Mnet that we will build the network if they get the license. They've got a good chance of getting one. I want to use your equipment, but I want to be paid for doing that in that building of that network. Well, Nokia couldn't help me. They were just too busy at the time. They're barely surviving today. So I flew from Helsinki actually to Stockholm. And another providence. South Africans could not go to Sweden at all. There was a complete ban on South Africans. Because these were still the days of apartheid, by the way, technically anyway. But the ANC had been unbanned, and the ANC were operating in South Africa. And I had got very close to the ANC, in particular the guy who headed up telecommunications. And he's still a good friend. Every time my son bumps into him on a plane or something, he sends greetings. So the Swedish government got hold of they had a consul in South Africa just to look after their affairs. Check out with the ANC whether I could be given a special visa to come there. The ANC said, sure, he's okay. Wow. So beginning to reap the benefits of my years of fighting apartheid. A lot of people, a lot of Africans and leaders in African circles knew my stance. It also so happened that the consul was a lady I knew very well indeed. She was in our church, her husband was a deacon, and we'd actually lived in an apartment below their home when we first went back to England, because her husband's an architect and he was designing our new home, and while we were building it, we stayed with them. So, that's how well we knew them. Wow. She calls me up and she says, John, what's going on? I've had instructions from Stockholm to give you a visa to go to Sweden. Yeah, that's right. I want to go to Sweden. Okay. Send your passport, which I did. So when I rolled up in Stockholm, I was given red carpet treatment. Wow. Directors of Ericsson were at the airport to meet me. And I had the most incredible relationship with Ericsson's after that. It really was one of the best relationships I ever had in business. I persuaded them that, if they would go with me, give me a fair share of all the equipment, we would be buying billions of dollars worth of equipment. And they happily gave it. Sure. Well, the rest is history. Mnet won the license, and we built the network. Today, it's the biggest cellular network in Africa. It's all over Africa, called MTN. It was one of the people that worked for me, and had worked for me in 3 different jobs, by the way. He always said, some people never learn. I never found out whether he meant he didn't learn or I didn't learn. This is the 3rd time he worked for me. He produced that license for Mnet. And so when we got the job and got the contract, he actually built the network as well. And went on to build it in Nigeria and all over the place. And not long ago, a few years ago, he emailed me to say, John, I just thought you should know that all the years of witness, the Lord called me to himself, and I'm now active in my church, etc., etc. He was saved. Wow. Yeah. Wow. But I mean, how about these for providences? Yes. Everything just lining up. Yes. And those contracts were worth fortunes, and we made fortunes of profit. Yeah. I could go on. That's just one. Yeah.
So your faithfulness matched God's faithfulness.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. So as you walked in a simple faith towards the Lord, he then showed up for you, right? In his sovereignty over your life. That it's incredible, and it's helpful to see people who are at 84 and are so successful and, have lived it and can now say, this is how God guided me, and this is how God blessed me, and it was worth it. Even sticking your neck out during apartheid and not knowing how that actually was going to end up when you chose to respect people first and treat them as God says that we should treat.
No, I mean, there's no question about that. But I don't want to give the impression that it was all plain sailing, straightforward, simple. I'm a human being, and God was always faithful, but I wasn't. I've got to admit, I think in that book on work, I actually dedicated it to all my employees, past and present, and I said, and also to get my forgiveness forgive me for all the times when I failed to do all of the things that are there. We're imperfect, and there were many slip-ups in between. But the incredible thing was that God overruled in some of the most amazing situations, and ruled in our favor. In fact, we had developed a strategy for the company in which there were probably something like 20 opportunities that we had listed. I've just mentioned cellular, but there were a lot of others, major opportunities. I remember my chief financial officer one day saying, John, if only 2 or 3 of these come off, we will be made. Every single one came off.
Wow.
Every single one.
Wow. Thank you for reminding us that, we can fail and God still loves us and directs our path, even in our failures, even in, just mess ups relationally. He can still clean up our messes.
Oh, he does, yes, absolutely. And as I said earlier, I don't think that my stockholders actually deserved the benefits that they derived in all of this. But I'm reminded of when the Israelites were taken into exile in Babylon. The message to them, and I think it was probably Jeremiah, said, you go there and prosper. And God, in fact, not only prospered the Israelites there, but he prospered Babylon. And that's exactly what happened really to my stockholders. They prospered because God was good to me.
That's great. I don't want to ask how close they were to Babylon.
Well, the environment in which we live is Babylon.
It's true. It's true. I'm so grateful to get to piece all of these things together and just kind of grab some of your wisdom in these situations. If we look at more relational situations, is there some good advice that you could give us in our day-to-day if we're not the head of a company or even business-minded, because I am not? What are some things that you've learned in your life that we can take away and implement and lean into?
Well, again, let's get to Scripture. What does Paul say? He said that godliness with contentment is great gain. And he said he'd learnt to be content in riches and in poverty. And I think that's one of the things that we need to learn, is to be content. And in my book, I mentioned an example of a couple that became very great friends. I'll have to step back a bit here and give you another one of these amazing providences. In our youth, we would conduct open-air services. Now, our church was the Central Baptist Church, which was basically in downtown Pretoria, and it was situated just 100 yards from the busiest intersection in Pretoria, traffic light intersection. But 24/7, this was a busy intersection. So we would go onto the corner with a little pedal organ, which my mother-in-law played, and about maybe 10 or so young people would go there. We would sing and we would shout out Bible verses, and somebody would give a sort of a 5-minute message. Step to the front and shout out a message until you were hoarse. We did this every Sunday night before church. I'm not sure that this is something I'm going to recommend we should do at Heritage here on the corner, but it was what we did. And really, even if it was foolish, God in his foolishness used it. We would then invite people to come back to the church where we would deal with them on one-on-one if they wanted to be saved. We always got a number. They were always blind drunk. And they'd come to the back, I think, expecting to get some food or money or something. Apparently, now I have no recollection of this, partly because this was really a weekly event. But on one occasion, a man did respond, and he did come to the back with me, and apparently I led him to the Lord. So I have no recollection, but he does. I then went off to England and spent the next 3 years in England. And when I got back, my best friend said, "Oh, by the way, John, there is an African fellow. He keeps coming to the church looking for you." And I told him, "You'll be back soon." So he said, "When he comes, know who it is." Okay. Next week, there was a guy smiling from ear to ear, as pleasant and as cheerful as could be. And he ran up to me and shook my hand warmly. "Thank you, brother, thank you." I didn't know what it was about. Then he explained to me that I had led him to the Lord some 3 or 4 years earlier. By this time, he was the leading elder in his church in an African area and doing a fantastic work. His name was David Maroshani and his wife's name was Esther. I mentioned them, by the way, in my book as well. We got very good friends. And as I said, he developed well and he did a great job in the church, etc. And we actually had them down on a vacation once when we were living in Cape Town as well. We gave them a vacation down there. But when we got to know them a bit better, I said to him, "Now tell me, David, what is your job?" And he said, "Oh, I'm a messenger in the South African Mint, people who print the money." And he was very good about, very happy about that. It was a great job, and I thank the Lord for it. I've been there for 30 years or something, or 20 years. And these Africans all over, they are very faithful, reliable people. And then I said, "And Esther, what did you do?" And she smiled from ear to ear, and I thought, well, boy, she must be the secretary to the chief executive. She said, "I clean the toilets, and I do it to the glory of God." Well, I tell you what, I won't see them in heaven because they'll be up at the main table. Their lives were exemplary, absolutely wonderful people.
God's providence in your life is just amazing.
It was just amazing. And so, commit yourself to the Lord.
Amen.
And the scripture also says, "He that honors me, him will I honor."
Thank you for that reminder. I think we get bogged down in our day-to-day, and it's great to kind of step back and actually see from a different perspective what God has for us. John, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. It's been a huge pleasure. I think our listeners will love hearing your stories and getting to know you a little bit as well. So thank you for sharing your heart and your life with us.